Hi guys, this is John Edward Willie and this is Circle 8, and I am wondering aloud while I wander to the gym about three things. Each of these three things begins with a P: participatory, particular, and poetry. Now, I'm not trying to be coy or fancy or anything like that, but what I want to discuss is the possible relationship between this desire, this intention a lot of people have to recover their ability to make sense of their own life, or to author their own life, or determine their world on one level or another. And I say participatory to animate the idea that one is not being passive, not being a mere recipient of reality, but that one is, on a certain level, actively deciding who one is and what one is. And on a certain level, that comes from a foundational kind of place that is also a place of peacefulness and sanity. And so there's definitely a relationship between the idea that you can discover a way of being in the world that is simultaneously at home as well as a source of creativity and excitement. And I was speaking to a friend earlier about this very subject, and what I sort of realized is that there is a connection between this kind of pursuit and what I take to be my love for poetry. So I tend to compartmentalize or sort of balkanize my ideas, and that's unfortunate. So in this video and in Circle 8, I'm bringing many of these balkanized, separated endeavors of mine into a circulatory whole, which I call Circle 8. And so I think of poetry, and I do poetry. I'm kind of a failed poet, you know. I'm yet to be published, but it's something I do excitedly. And a part of it is the desire to have a voice, you might say, to express myself. But there's a fundamental element that comes with the practice of creating poetry, which means reading poetry and responding to poetry. And so I find that poetry, which is the third thing that I'm talking about, is actually the place where I discover what I think a lot of people are seeking, and what they're seeking in what I call a participatory relation to reality. Like, in other words, there's a sense in which one can think clinically about this stuff, and then you can, and I mean this in a positive way, that you can think about meditation, you can think about pursuing all of these ideas that are related to discovering the way in which you're not merely just being pushed around by reality. I mean, that's an exhilarating notion to discover, because it liberates you from this paralyzing sense of pure determination. Of course, I don't mean to suggest that this means that there's some kind of absolute freedom that's discovered as if one were not at the same time determined. But I will leave that to another kind of video, because what I'm wanting to do is to link between these two. And again, what I'm trying to say is that it's in writing and reading poetry that I think I'm doing in many ways what others are seeking, because what poetry is doing is animating the particularity of our lives. Like, in other words, poetry as a way of thinking isn't merely about lyric poems or about creating expressive ideas. One can think about the act of poetry itself as a way of being attentive to what is most precious and to what is most real in our lives, and that is the immediacy and singularity of the world around us. You know, I think poetry on a fundamental level is not a social project, right? It's not a social project. But what it is able to do is to animate the ability we have to reclaim, to take back what is actually really important, which is the physical, sensory, auditory, visual, felt, like real, gritty, dirty, grimy, lyrical, elegant, spontaneous, unexpected, painful life in front of us. And there's no other way to say it except that you have to be attuned to this world. And poetry is, time and again, the most ancient device for acquiring a sensitivity to the meaningful lives that we have. And what I mean by meaningful is that it's found in the everyday life that is around us. And that is, in fact, what we're seeking when we're seeking a mindfulness, when we're seeking this transcendental meditative state. Because what I'm doing in speaking this way is I'm sort of violating certain ideas that people have about what this kind of thinking means, about what meditation means. And it's like violating a religious person's idea of prayer. Like, can you reappropriate the idea of prayer? Can you reappropriate the idea of meditation? And if that's possible, then that means a radical reimagination of what prayer and meditation even is. And that's precisely the path that I'm on, because I think there's a sense in which one can carry this out into the world that we live in. In other words, these things, this idea of meditation or prayer or being aware, isn't something that you can practice like every once in a while. Like, it's not like something that you do as a way of like getting yourself feeling better or being grounded. It's something that you're either doing all the time or not at all. And there's something crucial about the sensitivity demanded in seeking to keep the elements of the mind in check. So I think there's a sense in which, like, if you're speaking about particulars, which honestly I think is the only thing real. I don't think of ideas or the future or the past or theories as being more real than the particularity of our life. So if you begin with that kind of injuncture, you then discover that on a certain level you face a certain limitation in terms of what you can say or believe to be real. But I think that the poetic effect, and again, this isn't probably the intention of poets or even the desire, but the effect, the kind of result of practicing the reading of poetry, unexpectedly attunes you to the preciousness of life in a way that isn't betraying your humanness, your intuitive sense of being able to smell bullshit. Like, poetry is the most sincere, and there's something fundamentally insincere about all self-help. And poetry, on a certain level, restores that urgency of selfhood by restoring the immediacy of our life in the most realistic kind of depictions possible. And of course, this demands an explanation of what I mean by poetry, and so I think about poetry as representing art in itself. So on a broader level, what I'm addressing is the question of the role of art in our lives. Because let me step back a few steps, right? And let me tell you that I think that a major tragedy in our culture as a whole is sort of like the complete absence of that sensitivity to the aesthetic, in the sense in which it never really had a chance, because from a lot of people's points of view, it's a European perspective, or it's sort of something that is secondary to life itself. And so, as I mentioned probably before, poetry often is relegated to being merely a way of expressing holiday get-togethers a certain idea of affection or a certain notion of connection, of which in many ways obliterates the possibilities of poetry in restoring what is in fact most soulful, what in fact is most real. And so I don't mean to belabor the thought, because what I mean to do is to address the question of the relationship between art and the pursuit of mindfulness, or the pursuit of Buddhist or Christian styled or even quasi-religious practices like mystical or occult, or even like practices that don't really appear to be like this but are more scientifically oriented, that have to do with the cult of rationality. I think that there's a certain level at which they're all attempting something that art in itself has already been offering, and a part of cutting off our European lineage has been cutting off a fundamental part of our civilization, which has to do with like what art can really mean in our lives, like what can learning how to look at great paintings. Because like if you're living a participatory life, or if you like speaking about learning to look at paintings, or learning to listen to music, or learning to read a poem in terms of classical ideals, there's a sense in which to be participatory, that is to actually be alive, to truly not be a passive, glancing, epiphenomenal victim of civilization. It ultimately means to win back this focus by learning how to actively read, actively listen, actively see, actively to be in the world. So it's not this heroic, adventurous, mythological, or romantic affair. The participatory in many ways is a sort of thing that is related to what we are, and to where we are, and to what our lives are actually like. And that's why I think that when I am reading poetry late at night or in the middle of the day, or I'm sort of repeating dumbly to myself certain poetic lines, or I'm allowing myself to unpack the complexities of a poetic sequence, because it seems to be opening up my own consciousness, I think that what I am doing is something that is outside of myself. It is something that has to do with the perception in the body. So that there's almost a sense in which poetry itself is the most ancient of mediums. Poetry is the most ancient of arts. And it's also the most immediate of arts. It's directly connected to the body, given that the poetic voice is a function of the body. There's a certain underlying aesthetic resonance in the pursuit of poetry. And again, I am sort of the belief that it's only the particular that in fact is real. That's a position that's called nominalism in philosophy, and it's a unpopular position, and it ultimately means that the idea of something is secondary to the reality, and the reality itself, to play on Heraclitus, the philosopher who in many ways thought that reality was beyond comprehension, except that there was an underlying logos for him, but that there's a sense in which what one discovers is that although we think and we have theories, thinking is ultimately inductive, and that induction begins with our brains and our bodies and our experiences. So simply like beginning with the body, that itself is weirdly radical in philosophical tradition, and yet it has its adherents, and yet they tend to develop outside of philosophy, because there's a sense in which it makes sense that one would then pursue philosophy by these means. And so I'm sort of asking multiple questions at once, but I'm trying to orient it or ground it in these three notions and the ways in which they work together reciprocally. Because see, I think there's a great value to be found in exploring ideas in that way, with thinking in terms of fundamental ideas like participatory, particular, poetry. Thinking about these three ideas might seem absurd, but there's a sense in which the very value of thinking and of the mental life is found in this like exploration of the ways that ideas relate, the ways that they make musical sense together. And so that whenever we're thinking or talking or writing or whatever, we're not just doing like what is often done in the Western classical musical tradition, which is honoring the greatness of the past by effectively repeating it. What we're doing is more akin to jazz, more akin to impressionist art making. And it has much more to do with bringing ideas to life, in the sense that to live a participatory life means that you are bringing your life into existence through the very language that you use at each particular moment. And so there's a sense in which one is the very instrument through which you are singing. And the poetic instrument for me is preferred, but there are obviously many different ways of discovering a way of getting yourself to see what is most real and most valuable. You know, reading itself is crucial in being able to see outside of yourself. Like poetry is tapping you into the particularity of your life. But there's a sense in which all reading, in many ways, is doing a similar thing, which is sort of breaking or shattering your ideas about what you think life and reality is, and doing it in ways that are not necessarily direct or even graspable. But ultimately, it has to do with making you a more expansive, more cosmopolitan kind of person. To be, as Socrates said, a citizen of the world. And so it's not just reading, it's not just poetry. It's any instrument, any tool, any means that gets you outside of yourself. So if you think about different things as just being different techniques, then you discover that going through shit, like facing like loss, facing illness with yourself or with others, or facing catastrophe, living through catastrophe, trying to make sense of it afterwards. Sometimes like doing particular drugs can sort of open up elements of the consciousness that are more like gigantic question marks than anything else. And so I think with that kind of orientation, one is attuned to the specificity of life, like you're attuned to the finitude of life. You become aware of how short it is, how precious it is. And that awareness itself of the possibility of absence is at the heart of the existential urgency which motivates a person who reads and who pays attention. I hope that makes sense. You know, I'm just greatly enjoying the exploration of these three ideas and sort of giving the viewing public a sense of what I have been doing in practice for a long time. Not that I do it this specific way, because what I've ultimately done though is to think about ideas in an abstract way where you can think that all of or most of the human story, human consciousness, is organized like archetypally or mythologically. Like there's a lot of people out there on YouTube who talk about that in terms of how stories help us make sense of who we are. But the angle that I have is exploring the ways in which fundamental ideas have shaped human consciousness. And so there's a sense in which you can, if you wanted to, break it down into like a list of fundamental ideas. Like they could be like 50 ideas or 100 ideas that are at the heart of all of human language, human discussion. I mean all of it. And what I mean is that these are ideas like what is beauty, what is justice, consciousness, time, God, meaning. Like these are ideas that in many ways are at the heart of the architecture of our minds that are ultimately organizing our thinking. And my love for a long time now has been exploring these ideas. But the thing that kind of makes me weird is that I've always explored these ideas in terms of the so-called great books. So I fell onto the so-called great books tradition when I was in my early 20s, with a deep desire to not only read these books and sort of pull myself up to the table as I had imagined at the time, but ultimately to discover the ways in which I thought that the fundamental ideas of civilization and consciousness could be examined through the reading of Plato and Aeschylus and Dante. And obviously, or not obvious to you, but to me, I kind of fell on my face. You know, what I pursued was a very amateur, deeply amateur, sophomoric endeavor. And there's a lot of smart people who will warn you against being a self-educated person, against being autodidactic, and trying to do this stuff on your own is like audacious. But that's what I did for a long time. And so it was the ideas that organized my thinking. And I'm speaking today about 3 ideas that aren't even a part of the major ideas that make up our thinking. There are more sub-ideas, right? And so there are fundamental books. Like there's a sense in which one can explore and sort of swallow whole Western civilization and consciousness by reading the great books, whether it's in the Western tradition or not. And so I think there's also a sense in which the organizing questions are the other thing that are at the heart of my own self-education, my own pursuit of self-education. So the way that I have developed this self-made encyclopedia that I've been composing in the dark, called the Architect, it's organized in a way that thinks about knowledge in this way. And what's interesting is that even Circle 8 itself is in many ways an attempt to upload the Architect, except to make it completely, you know, whatever this ends up becoming. And so the Architect itself, my own encyclopedia, has a brain within it. It has a sort of cortex that I think of as like a codice. In other words, it's sort of like a collection of ways of thinking about what counts as valuable knowledge, what is worthwhile, what we should hold on to. And so a part of this are like words that I think are the most beautiful, valuable words that we have. And then there are ideas that I organize in 3 ways. And the biggest way I organize them is how I've explained it already in terms of the great ideas, you know, justice, beauty. And that's what I call meta-memetics. I know that's a crazy word, but that's the word I use. And the second tier are memetics. And those are sort of the ideas that I've explored today with particularity or participatory, the particular, and poetry. And then there are mini memetics, which is my attempt to practice breaking down ideas into their most fundamental form, so that in many ways you can understand bigger ideas by understanding the more fundamental ideas themselves. And so in exploring metamemetics, though, that's sort of in many ways at the heart of this brain, so to speak, within my self-made encyclopedia. And so what I'm doing when I am going to bring in to reality a visual, verbal example of this exploration of 3 ideas, I am practicing what I think of as being a synoptical endeavor. And by synoptical, I mean that the value of ideas, the meaning of ideas in our life, is found in the relationship between these things. Like, that's why it's like, it's bad to read philosophy in isolation. I mean, not only like, I'm saying two things at once. Philosophy must be read in terms of life. Like, we have to think about philosophy in terms of life, but we also have to read philosophical books against one another. Like, they're meant to be read in conversation with one another. And I know that's really just increasing the difficulty of the pursuit of philosophy, but ultimately it should be seen as an ideal outcome, or ideal praxis, which is a synoptical philosophical approach that reads philosophy in terms of its relational value. And of course, you want to understand the ideas themselves, and you want to understand the books themselves, so you do have to practice that. And to understand an idea in itself, whether a basic idea or a more complex idea, you do have to slow down and look at that in particular. But what you're ultimately trying to do is to play with these ideas in ways that are not necessarily beneficial in an obvious way, but are in many ways significant in themselves. Like, there's an element of being speculative and thinking that is meaningful because it's meaningful, and there's a sense in which you either get this or you don't. But I think it's at the heart of a rich interior life. And in many ways, it's not so interior when I vocalize it, so it's now been exteriorized. And so I think that's what I'm doing here, is exteriorizing these notions that have been growing in me, in my mind, and in my writing for a long time now. And so I'm about to go do my leg workout. I'm definitely not looking forward to this. I do it about once a week, and it's the most difficult workout, but it is almost religious. So I'm John Edward Willie, and I love you guys. If you're listening, I love you even more. Thank you.